if you like the house, there's a good chance someone else does, and they're going to come back for it. So then you're playing a little race. Another reason people are not buying is they think the house will still be there. And I don't want you to be that afraid. I don't want you to be afraid like, I got to put an offer in this second. I want you to be able to take a time in figuring out if this is the right place, if your commute's going to work and that kind of stuff. I'm not saying rush it, but don't sleep on it. Don't sleep on the house. Well, no, I mean, sleep on it overnight, but don't sleep for a week. Sleep overnight because that house will go. It may not go in one weekend, but it's going to go. So the thing is, when you find the house that you want, you should put an offer in. You just should, because you don't know what's going to happen. And now you can do inspection contingencies and other things. So take advantage of that. In particular, if it's in the location, because I've said before, like your house, love the location. If you love that location, that is the land, the neighborhood, that is the thing you cannot change. You can change almost everything else about a house. But I will absolutely jump on a house in a location that I want.